This begins Chapter 3, Lesson 8, dealing with extending multiplication. But first let's go over what you did yesterday and see how much you remember. So what I'd like for you to do in these warm-up activities is first state what property you would use to solve each problem, and then show the steps that you would use to solve these problems. So pause the video, go ahead, solve them, and then make sure you justify what steps you used. Alright, and then I'm going to go through and I'm going to solve them with you. So the first product, the answer is 500. And then the first property I'm going to use is the associative property. I'm going to multiply 4. Oops, it helps if I write the problem correctly. This product, the product I have written here is actually 400. Sorry, not 500. I wrote this problem wrong. But I'm still going to multiply 4 times 25 first, and I'm going to use the associative property to do that. So I'm going to multiply 4 times 25 first. It gives me 100 times 4, and it gives me 400. Now the first product I'm going to use here is I'm going to use the commutative property. I'm going to do 50 times 4 times 35, and that's the commutative. And then I'm going to multiply 50 times 4 times 35. That is the associative. There we go. And that gives me 200 times 35. And that gives me an answer of 7,000. So now for this one here, all I'm going to use is the associative property first. I'm going to take, since 66 and 50 are right next to each other, all I'm going to use is the associative. And then that gives me 30 times 22. And then 30 times 22 gives me an answer of 6,600. Now for this one, I'm going to change it so that I have 8 times 5. I'm going to multiply that first, times 31. That's the commutative property. When I multiply 8 times 5, I do 40. I'm sorry, first thing I'm going to do is change around. Then I'm going to use the associative property to multiply 8 times 5 to give me 40 times 31. 40 times 31 gives me 1,240. Alright, so hopefully you remember how to use those multiplication properties to solve problems. So now today we're going to solve problems that have to deal with money or greater numbers. So the first example we have is 3 times, that's a decimal, $1.05. So let's say I have 3 pens that cost $1.05. I have $1. Each pen costs $1.05 each. I want to buy 3 of them. Now, how much money do I have to make sure that I have? So that would be multiplying 3 times $1.05. So when I go through and I solve the algorithm, once my pen decides to cooperate, I'm going to multiply as if I'm multiplying whole numbers, and then plug in my decimal at the end. So I'm going to multiply 3 times 15. I did it again. 3 times 5, which is 15. And then 3 times 0, which is 0, plus 1 is 1. And then 3 times 1, which is 3. And if you think about it, well, if I have $1 3 times, I have $3, and I have 5 cents 3 times, that's 15 cents. So it would make sense that it's $3.15. Now, when I go through though, right now here, I don't have $3.15. I have to go through and say, oh, I have 2 decimal places, so I'm going to place my decimal place. And that's using the algorithm to solve that. It's not the world's worst place. You just have to kind of keep track, saying, okay, how many decimal places did I start with? Well, that's how many decimal places I end with. All right, let's try another one here, where we're going to do 15 8/10 times 5. let's say, Mrs. James buys 15 8 gallons of gas each week for her car. Well, how many gallons of gas does she buy in 5 weeks? So now going back and using our algorithm, and I'm just going to plug in my tenths here. And I don't really worry about this decimal point until the very end. So 8 times 5 is 40. And 5 times 5 tenths is 25 groups of tens, plus 4 groups of tens is 29 groups of tens. And then 5 times, this is in tens, that's ones. And then 5 times 1 group of 10 is 5, plus 2 more is 7 groups of tens. So I have 7, 9, and 0. And here, up here in my problem, I only have 1 decimal place. So I'm only going to put in 1 decimal place. And so that gives me 79 gallons of gas that she buys in 5 weeks. So the next thing I want to kind of go through with you, and let's just see, I'm going to give you some multiplication problems. And I'm going to give you the product. And what I'd like for you to do is plug in where the decimal point goes. So as I go through, I'm giving you ones where I don't put the decimal in the product, and I'm hoping that you can plug in the decimal. Whoa! Get rid of that, that's a little too much. You can plug in the decimal for me. Because with multiplying decimals, the challenge is not necessarily the multiplication part of it. At this point, by 5th grade, most of you guys have got a pretty good understanding as to how to multiply these decimals. It's just a matter of finding the correct spot to put the decimal. So if I'm looking here, in my factors I have 1 decimal point, 2 decimal points. So in my product I have to have 1, 2. So my decimal is going to go right there. In this I have 1 factor with a decimal and 2 factors with a decimal. So I have 1, 2 decimals. And so in my answer I have to go 1, 2. Notice how I'm starting from the back here. I'm not starting from the front, I'm starting from the back and moving that way. Here in my problem I have 1, 2 decimals, so in my answer I need to have 2 decimals. Maybe I should have picked one that had more than 1 decimal. And then here the same thing with this. I have 1 decimal here, 2 decimals here. So 2 decimals in my factors, 2 decimal places in my product. And hopefully that kind of clears things up for you. Alright, so now that's placing the decimals, which is probably the majority of your problems that you're going to be dealing with. But let's do one where you have to deal with some greater numbers. So Tasha Nicole Terriani holds the world record for the most number of soccer touches in 1 minute at 239. If she continued at this rate, how many soccer touches would she have in 1 day? So the only number they give you is 239, and that is for 1 minute. 239 in 1 minute. If you want to have a really smart moment, you could say that's her unit rate. So if we continue that rate, how many would she do, let's say, in an hour? Well, here's where they expect you to know some things. First of all, they expect you to know that there's 60 minutes in an hour. So that if you take 239 times 60, that will tell you the number of minutes, or number of touches in an hour. Then, they also expect you to know that there are not only 239, not only there are 60 minutes in an hour, but that there are 24 hours in a day. And that would tell you, that is the amount you would need to know to figure out how many she would have. It's take the 239 times the 60 minutes to give you how many hours, how many touches in an hour, and then give you the 24 in a day. So here we're multiplying some pretty big numbers. Anytime when I'm multiplying some pretty big numbers, I'm going to want to take a little moment and I'm just going to want to do some estimating. So let's just, so I kind of have a place here, I'm just going to say, well, we'll do 200 times 60 times 20. That's a lot easier to multiply in my head, and that gives me about 240,000, which is a lot. And then, just so that I know, like, I don't have to worry about decimals, but I kind of have an idea as to how big of a number I'm looking for here. And then, when I multiply this out, and I'm not going to beat you over the head with the algorithm here, but just that, know that setting up the problem, in this case, is probably the hardest part. And then when you get to the multiplying point, you get 344,160. And so, just even though our estimate's made is off by like 100,000, notice it's got the same value, the same place value as our estimate. And so that's how we can understand that it's reasonable. And since, you know, we rounded down 200 and we rounded down 24 to 20, it would make sense that this number would be less than this number. Alright, I'll give you some to practice with and see how well you do. So the first one we're going to do is 2 times $4.10. And I forgot my dollar sign here, so go ahead and solve that. And the next one you're going to solve is 5 times $12.65. And then you're going to solve 18 4/10 times 10. And let's do a greater number one where we're going to take 325 times 165. There's an example of a greater number one, and that'll be number 4. Alright, so when I go through, and hopefully you pause the video and actually do the work, because you don't get as much out of it if you just listen to me wah 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 wah. When you go through and you solve this, I say, oh, alright, well, 2 times 10 cents is going to be 20 cents, and then 2 times 4 is going to be 8, so I get $8.20. And then when I go through and solve 5 times $12.65, if I can multiply things, read my book correctly, 12.65 times 5, you're going to get 63.25. When I do 18 4/10 times 10, nice thing, hopefully you remembered about how to work this extending multiplication, I get, once my pen decides to cooperate, 184. Remember that great thing about multiplying by 10 is you're just moving decimal places over. And then doing this large number of 325 times 165, you get a very large number of 53,625. So hopefully you had absolutely no problems with that, and if you do, just let me know and I will sit down and work with you one-on-one. But if not, you will do just fine on your lesson, or on your homework, that is. And that concludes your lesson.